minutes this time.
Was it 12 last time or was it 10?
I think it was 10.
Oh, no.
You're just so thorough.
Oh, no. We're regressing. All right. Hi, I'm Tyler Van Haren. I'm an engineer here at Statsig, and today I'll be talking through getting a basic experiment set up. And so when you get into console and you go press create experiment, we're going to ask you for a name, and then we're going to give you a form that looks sort of like this. Let's walk through what we're doing there and sort of step through what exactly it means to be filling out these sections, right? One thing that I think is useful to do is actually think back to like a middle school science class, or I don't know, even elementary school science class, learning about sort of the scientific method, right? At least where I grew up, we had an acronym called FIOC, problem, hypothesis, experiment, observe, conclusion, right? Sort of walking you through the steps of it, and then obviously you just iterate a bunch. We're doing pretty much the same thing here. We're not putting baking soda into a volcano, but we are still running experiments, even though they're, on a website or an app or some product that we're building, right? And so sort of along similar lines, we're going to actually ask you for a hypothesis, we're going to ask you what you're measuring, and we're actually going to ask you what it means to be in that like test or control group, right? So let's start out with hypothesis. This is something that you probably already have, even if you haven't spelled it out so explicitly. You've gone through the work to make some change. You probably made that change for a reason, right? That reason is generally your hypothesis. So we're going to ask you to describe A, what change you made, and B, what effects you expected to see. And the whole rest of this process is really just us validating if your change has caused those effects. So for your hypothesis, this might be something like, we've redesigned the checkout flow and we think it's going to result in more purchases or like a higher conversion rate, right? That's like a hypothesis that we can go and test. Did it do that? Metrics are how we're going to actually measure if it did do that. And so for Statsig, we like to break it out into two sort of very generic boxes, primary metrics and secondary metrics. There's a few different schools of thought on like exactly what you should consider a primary metric and what you should consider a secondary metric. A pretty basic template I like to use is primary metrics are the things that I'm going to use to determine success. These are going to be like I said my checkout experiment was going to increase the conversion rate, so I'm putting the conversion rate here. This is very directly, here is the thing I'm trying to move. If I have moved it positively, then yes, my hypothesis was successful. And then I like to use secondary metrics as here are things that even if my hypothesis was successful, I might still not want to ship this thing because I regressed these, sort of like guardrails, right? So this might be something like performance. If I made the page take 10 seconds longer to load, but the people who did let it load actually converted really successfully, that's problematic. Or if I caused less people to come to the checkout page, that would also be problematic. So I like to use primary metrics as the thing I'm trying to move, and secondary metrics as sort of those other category of things. A few other schools of thought here, primary metrics can often just be like your most critical business metric, right? As like, everything should try to move this thing, like very broadly. And secondary metrics might be sort of your supporting metrics or like leading indicators of metrics, right? Not exactly what you're trying to achieve, but things that can sort of help tell that story. And then now that we've sort of defined A, that hypothesis, and B, what we're going to observe, let's talk about like what the actual experiment setup itself looks like. There's a very literal flowchart here showing you exactly what users are going to go through. And so that first two stages actually are just going to say like, is this user in the experiment? If you don't want to run on anyone outside the US, those layers would be what kicks them out. And then another thing worth noting here is there's a few places where you see percentages. Those are places where we randomize. So we're saying, hey, like some percentage of people should randomly get or not get this experiment, and some percent of people should get control, and some percentage of people should get test. Those are also random. Whenever we're doing any of those randomizations, we're using some salt from the experiment, and we're saying, hey, you told us to put 50 buckets towards this thing. We're going to take the user ID or the unit actually, and determine with that salt what does it hash to and which bucket does that hash fall into. Every spot you see a percent sign, that's basically randomization for us. I mentioned that unit of the experiment. This is whatever like you're using to randomize off of. Often this will just be your user ID, especially if you have some logged in experience. But it could be something like device ID, especially if I have some logged out experience. Or it could even be something like, what project is this user a part of, for instance, when we run experiments here at Statsig. And all of those are different, different salts are used for all of those so that they're like totally, the randomization is not correlated between them. So let's talk through whether or not the user should get a group. That first toggle that you'll actually have, and you should think of it like a toggle or like a dial that you can turn even, is allocation. This is your way of sort of ramping up an experiment's like population over the course of the experiment. If you have like a relatively small user base, it might make the most sense for you to just get all of that power right away and just set it to 100% and just run it as an experiment. But if you have like a user base where you could actually detect some regressions with a smaller percentage, one pretty common pattern is starting your experiment at like 5 or 10%, moving up to 20%, moving up to 50%, and then eventually hitting 100%. Once you feel comfortable that you're not causing any like regressions in user behavior, now you feel more comfortable exposing it to more people. Targeting gates are a way for you to add conditional restrictions to what users should be in the experience. You can actually just use a Statsig gate here, so you get all of the sort of flexibility that provides in terms of saying, I want to go off of these user attributes or these flags I put on the user object. Anything that you can do with a gate, you just get to put here. This really is just mimicking in code. You could literally say, if they pass this gate, then I want to see what experiment group they'd be in. That was a common enough pattern that we were like, okay, cool, we'll save you a line of code and just let you sort of control that directly here. And then any user who fails because of either of these, they are not in the experiment. They're just going to get the default encode. This will be the same value that a user is getting if the experiment isn't started yet, for instance. When you get any parameter from the experiment, you tell us here is a safe default to use if they're not in the experiment or we failed to fetch their experiment status for some reason, right? These are extremely safe fallback values. So now that we've determined that the user is in the experiment, let's actually talk about what group of the experiment they're in. You'll notice another percentage section here in terms of split. You'll often want just an even split between your groups. That'll give you the most power. But you might view your test as a little riskier, right? So maybe you only feel comfortable going with an 80-20 or something along those lines. You can also add additional groups here. So maybe you add 4 groups. You have control, test 1, test 2. You might want to say have a larger control group to account for the fact that you have these multiple tests comparing against it, for instance. And then we're actually going to talk through what it means to be in each of these groups. We do that via parameters. And so you could have a pretty basic parameter that's just variant or group, right? That'll say, yes, they are in control, they are in test. And then in your code, you're just going to say, okay, cool, get what group they're in, and then I'll handle everything myself. The cool thing you can do here is you can use parameters to go pretty in-depth in describing what experience the user should get. This could be something like, I have some ranking experiment, right? And I have all of these different variables of hey, how many should I fetch? How much weight should I put towards this variable? How much weight should I put towards this variable? You can define those directly in Statsig and then use them directly in code so that you don't have to do this huge forking of your logic, right? You can just say, yeah, for this value, use the value that I get back. So it's a pretty cool way to make things a little bit simpler there. And then one final thing that you can do about your groups is actually add some metadata to them so that you can refer back to it. We think that a pretty cool thing about Statsig is not only that it lets you run these experiments, but it can actually also serve as sort of a library for these experiments, so that when you are, it's been a year, let's go back, revisit some of the experiments we ran, what learnings we collected, and use that to inform our future experiments, right? It's, the whole process is about iteration. That gets a lot more powerful when you are able to easily tell exactly what you were doing with these experiments. If I just have some test called ranking experiment and then I see control and test, that's not super useful a year from now. If I have some test called ranking experiment, I have control and test, and then I go into them and I see here's this like nice description that I've written up, or even for like some UI-based experiment, here's an actual screenshot of it. That is like quite useful for remembering exactly what you did then, and also even just like in the sort of real time, whenever someone else wants to come look at this experiment, they can see, oh, this is exactly what they are sort of testing between. Yeah, so that gets you pretty much up and started on getting ready to start testing out your experiment and then giving it to people live in production. Thanks.